The snow had not stopped falling for 3 days. Lottie had counted each one, pressing her back against the wooden wall of the old cart, watching the white sky swallow the road behind her, watching the village of Ashford disappear into nothing. She had counted the days the same way she had once counted her worth, carefully, quietly, always afraid the number would not be enough. It was not enough. She still heard Dorian's voice in her ear, clear as the crack of winter ice. "You are nothing, Lottie. You never were. An omega without a pack is less than a stray dog. At least a dog has uses." She had not wept. She had thought she would. She had stood in the cold courtyard of the Ashford pack house, her small leather satchel clutched in both hands, and waited for the tears to come. They did not. There was only a hollow, ringing silence, the kind that follows something breaking. The rejection bond had snapped like an old rope, and the pain of it had moved through her chest like a blade being drawn slowly from a wound. Her designated mate had looked at her with such calm contempt. No rage, no guilt, only boredom, as though she were a matter long overdue for settling. She had walked away before he finished speaking. That had been 3 days ago. Now she sat in the back of a traveling merchant's cart, wrapped in a wool blanket that smelled of pine resin and old leather, her gray cloak pulled tight across her shoulders. The merchant, an elderly beta named Torvald, who asked few questions and accepted the last of her copper coins without comment, had offered her passage as far as the village of Eldenmoor. She had accepted without knowing what waited there. She had no map, no family, no pack bond left in her chest, only the faint, tender scar of where one had been. What she did have was a folded parchment, slightly damp at the edges, that she had taken from the notice board outside Ashford's grain hall the morning after her rejection. She unfolded it again now, smoothing the creases with her thumb. For sale, 1 cabin and parcel of land, situated at the northern boundary of Eldenmoor Forest. Abandoned. Condition unknown. Price, 8 silver marks or reasonable exchange. Inquire at the Eldenmoor gatehouse. 8 silver marks. She had 4, and a small brooch of her mother's, oval, pewter, engraved with a running deer, that a merchant might accept as the difference. The cabin was likely a ruin. She knew that. She was not a fool, whatever Dorian believed. But a ruin could be repaired, and a ruin was hers. No alpha above her, no pack hierarchy pressing down on her designation like a boot on her throat. No one to remind her, with a glance or a word or a silence, what she was. An omega, unmatched, unwanted. Free, she told herself, and pressed her cold fingers together in her lap. Eldenmoor appeared in the gray afternoon like something half remembered from a dream. A small settlement at the edge of a great pine forest, its thatched rooftops dusted with snow. A stone gatehouse standing crooked at the entrance like an old man leaning on a staff. Smoke rose from the chimneys. A blacksmith's hammer rang in the distance. A pair of children chased a chicken through the mud near the well, shrieking with laughter. It smelled of wood smoke and bread and the cold, clean sharpness of pine, and Lottie breathed it in slowly as Torvald's cart rolled to a stop. "Good luck to you, girl," the old merchant said without turning around. "Thank you," she said. "For everything." He made a small sound that might have been acknowledgement, and she climbed down from the cart into 3 inches of snow. The transaction at the gatehouse took less time than she expected. The gateman, a heavy-set beta with a gray beard and ink-stained fingers, looked at her 4 silver marks and her mother's brooch for a long moment. He turned the brooch over in his thick hands, examined the deer engraving, and slid the deed across the stone counter without further negotiation. "Land's yours," he said. "I'll warn you plain. Nobody's gone near that cabin in better than 2 years. Last fellow who owned it left in a hurry and didn't explain himself. You'll have trouble with the roof, like as not." "I can manage a roof," Lottie said. He looked at her slight frame, her gray cloak. the single braid of pale gold hair over her shoulder, and said nothing more. She took the deed, folded it carefully inside her cloak against her chest, and asked for directions. The path to the cabin wound north through the village, and then into the forest itself, following a narrow track through the pines that swallowed the last of the afternoon light almost immediately. The trees here were enormous, ancient, their trunks wider than two men standing side by side, their upper branches knitting together into a canopy that turned the snow to silence. Her boots crunched through the white ground. Her breath came in visible clouds. The cold pressed against her cheeks and the tip of her nose. But she kept walking, following the track, counting her steps. She smelled the cabin before she saw it. Wood smoke. She stopped. The gateman had said the cabin was abandoned. She had the deed in her cloak. And yet there, threading through the cold pine air, was the unmistakable smell of a fire recently banked. Charred wood, warm ash, the faint mineral scent of stone heated and cooled. She stood still for a moment, listening. Pine. Wind. The distant creak of a branch under snow weight. And then, very softly, a sound. A whimper. She moved forward before she consciously decided to. The track curved around a large boulder, and the cabin appeared. Low, stone-walled, the roof partially collapsed on the left side, but holding on the right, the wooden door slightly ajar. A thin thread of gray smoke curled from the chimney. Lottie pushed the door open. The smell hit her first. Warm fur, milk, pine needles, and something darker underneath. Iron, old blood. Her eyes adjusted slowly. The cabin's single room was dim, lit only by the dying fire in the stone hearth. A rough table along one wall. A wooden shelf, mostly bare. A sleeping pallet in the corner, collapsed. The floor was packed earth, and on that floor, curled together in a pile of old furs near the hearth, were 4 small shapes. Cubs. Wolf cubs. 4 of them. Small enough to hold in 2 hands. Their coats varying shades of dark gray and black and one pale silver. Their eyes still clouded with the haze of early life. They were huddled so tightly together that they looked like a single breathing creature, their small sides rising and falling. Lottie's heart did something she had not expected. It cracked open, quietly, like ice giving way to spring. She stepped forward, barely breathing, and crouched near the pile of furs. The pale silver cub made a sound, that same small whimper she had heard from outside, and pressed its nose against the flank of its nearest sibling. They're hungry, she realized. They're cold. She reached out carefully and touched the edge of the fur pile. The cubs stirred but did not scatter. They were too young, too weak. Where is their mother? She straightened, turning slowly, scanning the room. That was when she saw him. In the darkest corner of the cabin, barely visible in the dying firelight, something lay against the far wall. Large, very large. Dark fur, the color of a moonless night, matted along the left flank, with something dried and dark. A wolf. Not a cub, not a small creature. A wolf so enormous that for a moment she thought the shadows had taken shape. He was breathing. Slowly, laboriously, each breath a visible effort. And around his great neck, half buried in the dark fur, hung a chain of iron, the kind used to bind, not to adorn. It was broken at one link, trailing several inches of heavy chain that clinked faintly as his side rose and fell. Lottie did not move for a long moment. The wolf's eyes opened. Not amber, not gold, not the common wolf glow she had grown up seeing in the pack house. Blue. Pale. Cold. Ice blue. Eyes that had no business belonging to any creature she had ever encountered. Eyes that carried in them something that was not animal, and was not entirely human, and was entirely, terribly aware. He looked at her. She looked at him. The 4 cubs whimpered softly near the fire, and the biggest, most dangerous-looking wolf she had ever seen in her life did something she would think about for a long time afterward. He lowered his head onto his forepaws, slowly, like a mountain deciding to kneel. Not a threat. Something else entirely. Lottie's hand was on the door behind her. She could leave. She had every reason to leave. She had a deed to a cabin and no obligation to whatever this was. To this broken, chained, enormous creature and his 4 motherless cubs, and the question burning in her chest that she could not yet name. She did not leave. She unslung her satchel from her shoulder, set it on the table, and began looking for anything that might serve as a bandage. She worked through the night. There was no other choice, not with 4 cubs mewling weakly near a fire that would die before dawn, and a wolf bleeding slowly in the corner. Lottie was not a trained healer. She had learned what she knew from her mother, who had learned from hers, small practical things, the kind of knowledge that Omega women pass down not in formal lessons, but in quiet moments, hands guiding hands over herbs and cloth and the language of wounds. She built the fire up first, feeding it with the wood stacked against the outside wall, damp at the surface but dry enough beneath, and the pine caught well. The light steadied. The warmth reached the cubs, and they settled, pressing closer together, their small sides slowing from the frantic, shallow breathing of cold into something deeper, more restful. Then she turned to the wolf. He had not moved. His pale blue eyes tracked her across the room with an alertness that was deeply unsettling for a creature who had clearly lost considerable blood. A long gash ran from his left shoulder down across his flank. Partially clotted, but still weeping at the edges where the dried crust had cracked with his breathing. The iron chain dragged from his neck. Up close, she could see where it had worn the fur away, leaving raw skin beneath. Someone had chained him. Someone had hurt him badly enough that he had retreated here with 4 cubs and was slowly dying in the dark. She crouched at a careful distance. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said quietly. "I know you understand me. I don't know what you are exactly, but I know you understand." The blue eyes did not blink. "I'm going to clean that wound. It will hurt. I need you to stay still." A long pause. Then, very slowly, the great dark head shifted. Not away from her, but to the side, exposing the wounded flank more fully. Lottie let out a slow breath. She worked carefully, tearing strips from the hem of her spare underdress, linen, clean enough, and wetting them from her water skin. She had dried yarrow in her satchel, wrapped in cloth, and a small pot of pine resin salve her mother had taught her to make. She mixed what she could. The wolf made no sound as she pressed the cloth to the wound, cleaning it in slow passes, though she felt the muscles beneath her hands go rigid with controlled tension, not aggression, endurance. The particular stillness of a creature choosing not to react when every instinct screamed to. She understood that feeling intimately. The chain was the harder problem. The broken link had left a jagged edge that pressed against his throat, and she could not simply pull it free without causing more damage. She worked at it for a long time, her fingers cold and clumsy, until she found the angle. And then, carefully, she slid the iron free. It fell to the earth floor with a dull, heavy sound. The wolf exhaled. A long, shuddering release of breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. His eyes closed briefly, then opened again. "There," Lottie said softly. She sat back on her heels, looking at him in the firelight. Even wounded and still, he was extraordinary. The breadth of him, the depth of that dark fur, the strange, cold brightness of those eyes. She had grown up in a pack. She had seen wolves shift her whole life. She had never seen anything like this. She was very tired. She wrapped herself in her cloak, settled her back against the wall near the hearth, between the cubs and the door, not between the wolf and anything, and let her eyes close. She woke to the sound of breathing, close breathing. All 4 cubs were pressed against her, warm and solid and smelling of pine and milk. The pale silver one had wedged itself under her chin. The largest, a dark gray cub with a white mark on its chest, had its small head resting on her knee. Lottie went completely still. Then slowly, she exhaled and did not move to disturb them. The fire had burned low. Gray morning light came through the gap in the door and the single small window, which was covered with oilskin that let light through but kept the cold out, mostly. Her breath was visible. But the cubs were warm, and that was what mattered. She looked toward the corner. The wolf was gone. In his place, on the packed earth floor, sat a man. Lottie had grown up knowing that shifters existed. She had spent her life in a pack. She was not, strictly speaking, surprised by the concept of a man where a wolf had been. She was, however, entirely unprepared for this particular man. He sat with his back against the far wall, one knee drawn up, his arm resting across it. His hair was black and very long, braided in thick rows that fell past his shoulders, a few loose strands framing a face that was all hard angles and deep shadows, a strong jaw, a short dark beard, and a scar that cut through his left cheek, pale and old. He was large in the way that suggested he had been built for a purpose, broad across the shoulders, and he wore nothing except the worn hide trousers he had apparently found, or perhaps they were his stored here, and the marks of last night's wound, now bandaged in her linen strips against his ribs. His eyes were the same, pale blue, terribly clear, and fixed on her with an expression she could not read. He said nothing. She said nothing. The silver cub made a small sound of complaint at the shift in her breathing. "You stayed," the man said at last. His voice was low and slightly rough, as though speech itself were something he was reclaiming. "You did not have to." "You needed help," Lottie said. "So do many creatures. Most people walk past them." "I'm not most people." Something moved in those pale eyes, not quite what she would call a smile, something more guarded than that. The expression of a man who had heard promises before and filed them under a category marked unlikely. "No," he said, after a moment. "I don't think you are." Silence. The cubs stirred. The dark gray one with the white chest mark opened its eyes, looked at the man, and made a sound halfway between a whimper and a yip. He looked at it, and something happened to his face that Lottie had not expected. The hard lines did not disappear, but something underneath them shifted briefly, like light moving under deep water. "They need feeding," she said, because it was practical and true, and because she needed to say something before the silence got too full. "I know." He moved to stand and stopped, jaw tight, hand pressing against his bandaged side. "Carefully," she said. He looked at her. She met his gaze. He stood carefully. She pulled out the last of her dried provisions, hard bread, a small wedge of cheese, strips of salted venison, and began breaking them apart. She knew the cubs needed something more substantial, wolf's milk or broth. But for now, this was what there was. "Where did they come from?" she asked. A pause. "They are mine," he said. "In my care." "Their mother?" The pause this time was longer. "Gone." Lottie did not push. She had a voice for that kind of silence. She recognized it, the particular weight of a grief that had not finished settling. "And the chain?" she asked instead. Every muscle in his body went still. "That," he said slowly, "is a longer conversation. We seem to have time." He looked around the cabin, at the collapsed left side of the roof, letting in a thread of cold morning air, at the bare shelves, at the small, inadequate pile of wood. Then he looked at her, still in her gray cloak, still seated against the wall, with 3 of his cubs arranged against her, like she was a fixture of the landscape. "You own this place now," he said. It was not quite a question. "I have the deed. I did not know it had been sold." "It wasn't sold," she said. "Not until 2 days ago." He was quiet for a moment, processing something behind those pale eyes that she could not see. Then, with a careful movement that favored his wounded side, he crossed to the hearth and crouched before the fire, adding wood with a practiced efficiency that suggested he knew this cabin well. "My name is Orion," he said, without turning around. The fire caught. Light bloomed across the room. "Lottie," she said. He turned his head slightly, not quite looking at her, but in her direction. "Lottie," he repeated, as though he were storing it somewhere carefully. "Why did you come here? To Eldenmore, alone, in the worst week of winter?" She looked down at the silver cub now asleep in her lap. "I needed somewhere to start over," she said. He said nothing for a moment. The fire cracked and settled. "So did I," he said quietly. And somewhere in the pines beyond the cabin walls, the wind moved through the trees with a sound like breath, like something that had been holding itself tight for a very long time, finally beginning, in the smallest possible way, to let go. The roof took 3 days to repair. Orion worked in silence mostly, and Lottie learned quickly that his silence was not coldness. It was concentration, the careful economy of a man who did not spend words unless they meant something. He moved with deliberate precision despite the wound in his side, and twice she saw him stop. One hand pressed against the bandaged ribs, breathing slowly until the pain passed. Twice she opened her mouth to tell him to rest. Twice she closed it again, because she recognized that look too. The look of someone who needed the work more than they needed the rest. She kept the cubs fed and warm while he worked. That was how the arrangement established itself, without either of them naming it. She found, on the second morning, that the village of Eldenmore had a small market square that operated 3 days a week. She walked down through the pines with her empty satchel and her last few copper coins, and returned with dried oats, a crock of lard, a bundle of salted fish, and a skin of goat's milk that the cubs attacked with an enthusiasm that was almost violent. The dark gray cub, the one she had begun privately calling Ash, for the white mark on his chest like a patch of cold ash, knocked the skin sideways in his eagerness and soaked the front of her dress. Orion, coming through the door with an armload of timber at exactly that moment, stopped and looked at the scene. Lottie holding a dripping milk skin above her head, 4 cubs leaping around her feet, her pale braid swinging over one shoulder. And something happened in his expression that was brief and startling, and gone before she could properly identify it. "They do that," he said. "Helpful observation," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. The same guarded, almost expression as before. But she was beginning to understand that for Orion, that small movement was the equivalent of laughing openly. She hung her dress by the fire to dry and did not think about it further. On the 4th day, the village came to her. She was outside, breaking ice from the water barrel with the back of an axe, when she heard footsteps on the path from the village. She straightened and turned. 2 women and a man stood at the edge of the tree line, bundled in heavy wool cloaks. The women were beta, she could tell by the quiet of their scent, warm and neutral. The man was an alpha, lower ranked, the kind whose dominance was more habit than force. He had a wide, weathered face and watchful eyes. "Morning," the man said. He had the careful tone of someone delivering a rehearsed speech. "We heard the old Pell cabin had been purchased. I'm Gareth, head of the Eldenmore Village Council. These are Marin and Sula, our healer and her apprentice." Marin was older, perhaps 50, with silver-streaked hair and sharp eyes that moved across Lottie with the efficient assessment of someone accustomed to diagnosing things quickly. The apprentice, Sula, was younger, perhaps Lottie's own age, 23 or 24, with a round face and red cheeks and an expression of undisguised curiosity. "Lottie," she said. "I bought it 4 days ago." "Traveling alone?" Gareth asked, carefully. "Yes." A pause. He was going to ask about her pack. She could see it forming in his expression. The particular careful delicacy of someone trying to determine whether an unmated Omega arriving alone in winter was a problem or merely an irregularity. "I was released from my previous pack," she said, before he could find the words. She kept her voice steady and her chin level. "I have a deed and silver enough to establish here. I intend no trouble." Gareth looked at her for a long moment. Then something in his shoulders eased. "We're a quiet village," he said. "We keep our business to ourselves. You'll find no interference from the council, provided you contribute what you're able." "I have healing knowledge," she said. "My mother trained me. Not formally, but well." Marin's sharp eyes sharpened further. "Come and speak with me when you're settled," she said. Her voice was dry and direct, the voice of a woman who had long since stopped wasting time on pleasantries. "I've been wanting an assistant who doesn't faint at the sight of blood." "I don't faint," Lottie said. "Good." Marin turned to go, then paused. "There's a wolf been seen in these woods, large, black. The village hunters have been talking about it." Lottie kept her expression still. "Wolves are common in these forests. Not like this one." Marin's eyes held hers for a moment. "Not that large. The hunters want to track it." Another pause. "I thought whoever was living at the Pell cabin might want to know that." She held Lottie's gaze one moment longer, and then she turned and walked back down the path, her apprentice Sula hurrying after her with one last wide-eyed glance backward. Gareth nodded, said something about the spring gathering, and followed. Lottie stood in the cold until the sound of their footsteps faded, then turned and went inside. Orion was awake, sitting at the table with a length of leather cord and what appeared to be a partially completed bridle. The cubs sprawled in various states of sleep around him. He had clearly heard every word through the thin walls of the cabin. His hands were still on the leather. His pale eyes were unreadable. "Hunters," Lottie said. "I heard." She sat down across from him. One of the cubs, the smallest, a dark female she had started thinking of as Wren for her quick, darting movements, crawled immediately into her lap and turned in 3 circles before settling. "You need to shift less," she said. "Stay in this form while you're healing. It's safer." "I know. Do you have somewhere else to go, if they find you?" His hands resumed their work on the leather, slow and methodical. "No." The single word landed quietly in the room and stayed there. Lottie looked at him, at the old scar on his cheek, the braided black hair, the careful blankness he wore over his face like armor. She thought about the iron chain. She had not forgotten the iron chain. "The men who chained you," she said, "are they looking for you?" A long silence. The fire cracked. Wren made a small sound in her sleep. "Yes," he said. "Who are they?" He looked up from the leather. Those pale blue eyes found hers and held, not threatening, not evasive, just careful. The way a man looks at someone he is deciding whether to trust. "People who want something I won't give them," he said at last. "What do they want?" "A kingdom," he said. The word fell between them like a stone into still water, and the ripples moved outward in the silence, and Lottie felt the shape of something much larger than a ruined cabin and 4 wolf cubs and a wounded man beginning to take form at the edges of her understanding. She did not press further. Not tonight. Instead, she said, "The healer, Marin. She warned me. She didn't have to do that." No, Orion agreed. She knows what you are. Perhaps. And she didn't tell the hunters. He was quiet for a moment, looking down at the leather cord. There are people, he said slowly, who keep the old loyalties, who remember what things were before. He paused. Before everything changed. Lottie watched his face. The firelight moved across the scar on his cheek, across the severe lines of his jaw. He looked like a man carrying a weight so familiar he had stopped noticing it, which was, she knew, the most dangerous kind of weight, the kind that eventually crushed without warning. You should let me look at the wound again, she said. He blinked, as though the practical turn of the conversation startled him slightly. It's healing. I'll decide that. She stood, setting Ren gently aside. Take off the bandage. He looked at her. She looked back. She had, over 4 days, developed a particular quality of stillness in his presence. Not submission, which she was done with, but a kind of quiet steadiness that she was only beginning to recognize as her own authority returning to her, piece by piece. He removed the bandage. The wound was healing well. Better than it should have, the edges drawing together cleanly. She pressed the surrounding skin carefully with 2 fingers, checking for heat. His jaw tightened, but he did not move. Whoever your wolf is, she said quietly, working. He heals fast. A pause. Yes, Orion said. He always has. She wrapped the wound in fresh linen, tied it carefully, and stepped back. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Something unguarded and fleeting, something she might have called grateful, except that on a man like Orion the word seemed too small. Lottie, he said. The chain. He stopped. I want you to know, I did not come here to bring danger to anyone, only to keep them safe. He looked at the sleeping cubs. Only that. She followed his gaze to the small pile of dark fur by the hearth. I know, she said. And she did. But somewhere on the road between Eldenmore and wherever Orion had come from, something was moving through the dark with iron chains and bad intentions, and she had the growing certain feeling that it was only a matter of time before it arrived. The snow melted in the 2nd week. It happened overnight, one of those sudden shifts that the old-timers in Eldenmore called the wolf's breath, when the wind turned from the north and the temperature climbed just enough to soften the world's edges without truly warming them. The pines dripped. The track between the cabin and the village turned to dark mud. The cubs, who had spent their first days confined to the hearth, discovered the outdoors with a reckless enthusiasm that required Lottie to spend the better part of 2 mornings extracting them from various forms of trouble. Ash had climbed the woodpile and could not get down. Ren had found a hole beneath the cabin's stone foundation and wedged herself so thoroughly inside it that only her tail remained visible. The other 2, a pair of brothers she thought of as Flint and Reed, nearly identical in their dark gray coats, except that Flint had amber eyes and Reed's were green, had located a half-frozen stream 50 yards into the forest and were apparently determined to fall into it. Orion watched all of this from the cabin doorway, arms folded across his chest, expression caught somewhere between exasperation and something far softer. You named them, he said, when she reported the morning's events. They needed names. I had names for them. She looked at him. What were they? A pause. I hadn't decided yet. Then they're Ash, Ren, Flint, and Reed, she said, and went back to coaxing Ren out of her hole with a strip of salted fish. She did not see his expression, but she heard, behind her, the brief and quietly startled sound of a man who had not expected to be amused and who was not entirely sure what to do about it. She went to see Marin on the 8th day. The healer's cottage sat at the far edge of Eldenmore's village square, distinguished from the other stone buildings by the bundles of dried herbs hanging from every visible surface inside and outside: lavender, yarrow, wormwood, and a dozen others Lottie could not immediately name, all swaying gently in the morning air. The smell hit her before she reached the door. Sharp, green, medicinal, comforting in the way of things that heal. Maren opened the door before she could knock. "I expected you 4 days ago," the healer said, and stepped back to let her in. The inside of the cottage was warm and cluttered, and smelled overwhelmingly of pine resin and something sweeter underneath. Meadowsweet, perhaps. Bundles of herbs occupied every surface. A large work table dominated the center of the room, covered in clay pots and iron mortars and folded linen. Sula sat in the corner sorting roots, and looked up at Lottie's entrance with her characteristic expression of open curiosity. "I've been busy," Lottie said. "Yes." Maren moved to the work table and picked up an iron mortar, resuming whatever she had been grinding. "With your guest." Lottie said nothing. Maren ground in silence for a moment. "I'm not going to ask you questions you won't answer," she said. "That's not how I do things. But I'll tell you what I know, and you can decide what to do with it." She set the mortar down and looked at Lottie directly. 14 years ago, Maren said, there was a king, a true one, an alpha king of the old bloodline, the kind whose authority ran deeper than titles and politics. His name was known from the northern peaks to the southern trade roads. He was not a soft ruler, but he was a just one, and under his reign, the Pax kept peace. She paused. He had a younger brother, Castor, the kind of man who smiles most when you're not looking. Lottie stood very still. "The king was betrayed," Maren continued quietly. "Not in battle. In his own hall, at his own table. The details vary depending on who's telling it. Some say poison, some say a false treaty, some say the brother simply waited until the king was weakened and moved. What everyone agrees on is that the king disappeared. Not killed, or at least no body was ever shown. Just gone. And Castor took the throne." She picked up the mortar again. "Castor has ruled for 11 years. He is not a just man. The Pax that once kept peace now pay tribute in blood and grain and sons, sent to fight wars that serve no one's interest but his, and he has spent 11 years looking for something." She met Lottie's eyes. Something, or someone, he never found. The fire cracked in the corner. Sula had stopped sorting roots. "The iron collar," Lottie said carefully, "that I found on the wolf, that was not a hunter's chain." "No," Maren said, "it was not." They looked at each other across the work table. "He's going to find him," Lottie said. "Castor. He's going to track him here." "Men have been through Eldenmoor twice in the past 3 months," Maren said. "Castor's men. Asking questions. Wearing the brother's crest, a broken crown. They put on their shields now, the arrogance of it." Her voice was dry with old anger. "They haven't come to the cabin, yet." Lottie thought of Orion at the table, working leather in the firelight, of the careful blankness he wore, of the word he had dropped so quietly, a kingdom. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Maren was quiet for a moment. "Because you stayed," she said simply. "You found something wounded and abandoned in the cold, and you stayed. In my experience, that is not a small thing." She returned to her grinding. "And because Sula saw the cubs playing outside the cabin 2 days ago, and came home talking about them for an hour, and I would prefer to know that the people attached to those cubs are not going to disappear before I've had a chance to be useful." Sula, in the corner, had gone deeply red. "I didn't mean to spy," Sula said quickly. "I was gathering bark from the northern pines and I heard them, and I only looked for a moment." "She means well," Maren said without looking up. "She's impossible to discourage, which is either a gift or a catastrophe depending on the day." Lottie looked at Sula, at the open, earnest face, the ink-stained fingers. An unexpected warmth moved through her chest. She had not had a friend in a long time. She had not known, until this moment, how much she had missed the possibility of one. "The cubs are healthy," she said to Sula. "You can come and see them properly, if you like." Sula's face transformed. She walked back through the pines with a bundle of Marin's yarrow and a great deal to think about. A king. A betrayal. A missing throne. And a younger brother wearing it like an ill-fitting coat. 11 years of a man in the dark, carrying 4 small lives and whatever remained of himself, chained and hunted and finally run to ground in an abandoned cabin at the edge of a small, quiet forest. She thought about the morning she had arrived. The snow, the dead fire, the cubs cold against each other, the enormous dark wolf with the broken chain, and the eyes that held more grief than any animal should have been able to contain. She had not asked herself until now what Orion was, exactly, in the context of the wider world. She had been occupied with the immediate, the wound, the cold, the cubs, the roof. She had kept herself in the practical present, because the practical present was manageable, and the wider world was not. But the wider world, it turned out, had not been staying politely still while she managed things. She was 50 yards from the cabin when she heard it. Voices. Male voices, more than one, coming from the direction of the cabin track. She stepped off the path into the trees without thinking, pressing herself against the broad trunk of a pine, and listened. 2 men on horseback moved up the track below her. They wore heavy cloaks of dark wool, and on the front of each cloak, stitched in gray thread, was a symbol she had never seen before, but recognized immediately from Marin's description. A crown with a break across its center. A broken crown. They moved slowly, looking. "Trail goes cold here," one said. "Too much mud since the thaw." "Gateman said a woman came through a week and a half ago," the other replied. "Alone. Bought the old Pell land. A woman alone doesn't concern me. Castor says look at everything." They passed below her. She did not breathe. The horse's hooves made soft sucking sounds in the mud. The pine bark was rough and cold against her palms. Then one of the horses stopped. The rider turned his head, slowly, scanning the tree line. His eyes passed across the pine she stood behind. Lottie pressed herself flat, and did not move, and thought of nothing. She had learned in her years in Ashford's pack how to make herself invisible, how to quiet even the sound of her own breathing. An Omega's oldest skill, the stillness of someone who has learned that the best way to survive is to take up as little space as possible. The rider looked away. They moved on. She waited until the hoofbeats were entirely gone. Then she pushed off the pine and walked quickly, not running, because running left tracks, back to the cabin. Orion was inside with the cubs. He read her face before she said a word. He stood from the table. "How many?" he said. "2, Castor's men." She set Marin's herbs down. "They've been to the gatehouse. They know someone lives here." His jaw tightened. He looked toward the door. Not with fear, she realized. With something colder and more deliberate than fear. The look of a man calculating distances and outcomes. "The cubs can't travel," he said. "Not safely. Not in this cold." "I know." "Then we don't travel." He looked at her. "Lottie, you don't have to be part of this. This is not your—" "Whose cubs are sleeping in my cabin?" she said. He stopped. "Whose wound did I clean?" she said. "Whose roof did I repair? Whose name did I just protect by standing against a pine tree holding my breath for 4 minutes?" Silence. "This became my problem," she said quietly. "The night I walked through that door. I'm not walking back out of it." Orion looked at her for a long moment. The firelight moved across his face, across the scar, the dark braids, those pale, impossible eyes. And the look that crossed his face then was not gratitude exactly. It was something older and rawer than gratitude. It was the look of a man who had been alone for a very long time, in ways that went far beyond geography, encountering something he had stopped believing he would find. He looked away first. "Then we need a plan," he said. "Yes," said Lottie, "we do." Outside, the pines dripped steadily in the wolf's breath thaw, and somewhere down the muddy track, Castor's men were still riding. The plan began with Marin. Lottie went back through the pines before dawn the next morning, moving quietly along the tree line rather than the open track, her gray cloak pulled close against the cold. The village was barely stirring, a single light in the blacksmith's forge, the smell of bread beginning somewhere, a dog barking twice and then falling silent. She reached Marin's cottage and knocked twice, the way she had noticed Sula knock, and the door opened almost immediately. Marin looked at her face and stepped aside without a word. They spoke for a long time at the work table, voices low. Sula arrived halfway through, breathless and pink-cheeked from hurrying, and listened without interrupting. Which Lottie was learning was not entirely characteristic of her, and therefore meant she understood the gravity of what she was hearing. When Lottie finished, Marin was quiet for a moment. "Castor's men will come back," she said. "2 scouts means a larger company following. They'll return within 4 days, perhaps 5. I know. The cabin can't be defended, not by 2 people and 4 cubs. I know that too." Marin turned to her work table and began moving things with a brisk efficiency that suggested she had already made her decision and was now simply implementing it. "Eldenmore has kept its own council for 30 years, she said. "We've paid Castor's tribute without giving him anything that actually mattered. The village knows how to be unremarkable." She glanced at Lottie. "But there are those here who remember the old king's reign. Gareth is one. The blacksmith, old Perrin, is another. Men who were young when things were right and have been quietly angry ever since." "You think they'd help?" "I think," Marin said carefully, "that if a man came to Eldenmore who could prove what he is, there are people here who would consider that proof worth acting on." She met Lottie's eyes. "The question is whether your wolf is willing to be known." Orion's answer, when she brought the question back to him, was a long silence. He stood at the cabin window, the oilskin pushed aside, cold air coming through, the pale morning light falling across his face. The cubs were awake and tumbling over each other near the hearth. Wren had stolen one of Lottie's wool stockings and was dragging it triumphantly around the room. "If I am known," he said finally, "Castor will have no reason to be subtle. He will come not with 2 scouts, but with a war band." "And if you stay hidden," Lottie said, "those 2 scouts will find you anyway, and you'll face a war band with no one on your side." He turned from the window, looked at her. "You're asking me to trust people I don't know," he said. "I'm asking you to trust me," she said. "The people are mine to vouch for." Something shifted in his expression. A deep, quiet movement, like the first crack in winter ice that signals not destruction, but the coming of something warmer. "The cubs," he said. "Marin will keep them in her cottage. No one will touch them." He looked at the 4 small wolves currently using each other as stepping stones. Ash had achieved the top of the sleeping pallet and was sitting there with tremendous satisfaction. Wren had abandoned the stocking in favor of chewing the corner of a leather satchel. Orion's face did the thing it did, that brief, unguarded shift beneath the surface. And then he straightened and said, "Tell Marin yes." Gareth came to the cabin that evening with old Perrin the blacksmith, who was enormous and white-haired and had the permanently startled expression of a man who has spent 40 years next to loud fires. They came quietly, without torches, and Lottie met them at the door and brought them in. Orion stood at the far side of the room. The moment Gareth saw him, something happened to the older man's face. A slow, complicated sequence of recognition and disbelief, and something that might, in the end, have been called relief. The eyes, Gareth said quietly. Your father had those eyes. Every man who ever stood before the old throne knew those eyes. Orion said nothing. We thought you dead, Gareth said. Castor wanted you to think so, Orion said. Perrin, who had not spoken, made a low sound in his chest. Not words exactly, more the sound of a man confirming something to himself that he had long suspected. He looked at Lottie. How long has he been here? 12 days, she said. Perrin nodded slowly. We can do something with 12 days, he said, if we're quick about it. They were quick. Marin sent word through a network Lottie had not known existed. Old loyalty lines, she called them. The kind kept alive not in documents, but in memory. Passed from person to person like a flame carried cupped in two hands against the wind. Messengers went out from Eldenmoor on fast horses, riding south and east to settlements Lottie had never heard of. Names were spoken. The old signs were used. On the third day, Castor's warband arrived. There were 20 of them, armed men in dark cloaks with the broken crown on their shields, riding in a column up the main track through the village. Their captain was a lean, sharp-faced alpha named Bryn, who wore his authority like a weapon, scanning the village square with the flat eyes of a man who expected to be obeyed and had rarely been disappointed. He found Lottie standing in the square. Just Lottie, in her gray cloak, her pale gold braid over one shoulder, her hands clasped in front of her. Alone. The Pell cabin, Bryn said, not dismounting. I'm told you own it. I do, she said. You've had a guest. I've had wolves in my walls, she said calmly. This is a forest. It happens. His eyes narrowed. I'll need to search the property. Of course, she said. It's empty. You're welcome to look. He sent 4 men ahead. They rode to the cabin and came back 10 minutes later. Empty, they said. No sign of habitation beyond the woman's own belongings. She watched his jaw tighten. The village, he said. We'll search it. By whose authority? Said a voice. Gareth stepped out from the far side of the square. Beside him stood Perrin, who was holding a blacksmith's hammer in one hand with the casual ease of someone who simply happened to have it. Behind them, and Lottie had not known how many there would be, she had hoped but not known, stood others. Men and women of Eldenmoor, silent in the morning cold, arranged across the square with the patient, certain immovability of people who had made a decision and were not reconsidering it. Eldenmoor answers to the crown, Bryn said. Yes, said a new voice. It does. Orion walked out of the space between 2 buildings. He had not come in his wolf form. He came as a man. In the leather armor Perrin had worked on for 3 solid days and 2 nights, dark and fitted, the crossed chest straps and the bracer on his left forearm. His black braids were pulled back. The scar on his cheek caught the gray morning light. In his right hand, he carried a sword that old Perrin had apparently kept wrapped in oilcloth beneath his forge floor for 11 years, because, as the blacksmith had told Lottie quietly the night before, some things you keep, because you believe the day will come when they're needed. The sword bore the old king's mark on its crossguard, a mark that several of Castor's own men recognized, because she saw it move through them. That recognition, like a wave, through standing grain. Bryn's horse shifted under him. The crown, Orion said, walking forward at an unhurried pace. His pale blue eyes fixed on Bryn without heat, without fury, with something far more unnerving than either. Certainty. You said Eldenmoor answers to the crown. He stopped in the center of the square. It does. Bryn's hand went to his sword. I wouldn't, said Gareth from behind him. Bryn looked around the square, 20 armed men, and a village of people who had been quietly, patiently furious for 11 years, blocking every exit, and an enormous alpha in Old King's armor standing in the center, with an expression that made it very clear he had not survived 11 years of chains and hunting by being careless. Bryn's hand came away from his sword. "You have no army," he said, but his voice had changed. "I have messengers who have been riding for 3 days," Orion said. "By tonight, I will have an army. By tomorrow, Castor will know that his scouts found what they were looking for, and that they did not bring it to him." He let that settle. You can choose what side of that news you'd like to be on. The silence in the square was absolute. A single crow called from the rooftop of the grain hall and flew away. Bryn dismounted. He did not draw his sword. He set it point down in the mud of the square and stepped back from it. 3 of his men followed. Then 4 more. Then the rest, one by one, in the gray morning cold, until 20 swords stood in the mud of Eldenmore Square, like a strange, dark harvest. What followed was not a single battle, but a season. The careful, grinding work of reclaiming something that had been taken by patience and politics, and would need to be returned the same way. Messengers came and went. Pack leaders arrived, first cautiously, then with more certainty, drawn by the news that had traveled the old loyalty lines like fire following a trail of pine resin. Old alliances were spoken aloud for the first time in a decade. Castor did not come himself. He sent representatives who arrived expecting a fugitive and found instead a court in formation, convened in the largest hall in Eldenmore with Gareth keeping records and Merrin standing at the back with her sharp eyes missing nothing. Each representative left carrying news that Castor had not wanted sent. It took until deep spring. Castor surrendered the throne not in a blaze but in the cold administrative manner of a man who had run out of moves. His alliances collapsed, his tribute lines cut, his warband reduced to men who had made the choice in Eldenmore Square and spent the winter reconsidering everything. He was brought before a council of pack leaders and answered for 11 years of wrongs. He was stripped of title and lands and sent under escort to the eastern frontier, to a keep without power and with guards who would not be persuaded. He was alive. Orion had insisted on that. "He is my brother," he said, when Gareth had suggested other options. "What he did does not change what I am, and I will not be changed by it." Lottie, standing in the doorway of the hall when he said it, thought that this was perhaps the truest thing she had ever heard a person say. The cabin became something different in spring. The roof, fully repaired, no longer leaked. The left wall was rebuilt in stone. The garden plot Lottie had cleared in a burst of restless energy during the long diplomatic weeks now held the beginnings of a medicinal herb garden that Marin supervised with opinionated enthusiasm, and Sula tended with cheerful dedication, appearing most mornings with dirt on her hands and some new observation about the properties of yarrow. The cubs grew, rapidly, in the way of young wolves. Ash was the size of a large dog now, his authority among the 4 unquestioned. Wren remained the smallest and the most relentlessly clever. Flint and Reed had developed a cooperative approach to mischief that kept everyone in a permanent state of mild vigilance. They were learning to shift, haltingly, the way young wolves do, half in, half out, more amusing than dignified, though Orion supervised these attempts with a seriousness that no one commented on. On a morning in late spring, when the pines were putting out their new pale green growth, and the forest smelled of sap and wet earth and the distant sweetness of something beginning, Orion found Lottie at the garden plot. She was kneeling in the dark soil, pressing seeds into rows with her fingers, her gray cloak discarded over the fence post, her pale braid loose and a little untidy from the morning's work. He stood behind her for a moment. "There are things that need settling," he said. "At the Capitol. Formally." She pressed another seed into the earth. "I know. I'll need to leave within the week." She was quiet for a moment. The sun was warm on her shoulders. The soil was cold under her fingers. Somewhere behind her, a cub, Reed, by the sound of him, was attempting to climb the fence. "How long?" she asked. "Months," he said. "Possibly more." She sat back on her heels and looked up at him. He was standing in the morning light with his usual stillness, and she had learned to read beneath that stillness now, learned to see what moved underneath the surface of him. She saw it now, the thing he was not quite saying. "Orion," she said. "I have no right to ask you to leave what you've built here," he said carefully. "You built it yourself, without help, before I had any claim on anything worth claiming." He paused. "I am not going to tell you what to do with your own life." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're terrible at this," she said. He blinked. "You're standing there," she said, "trying to give me a choice without actually giving it to me, because you're afraid if you ask plainly, I'll say no, and you'd rather leave with uncertainty than risk a real answer." She tilted her head. "That's what you're doing." A long silence, then quietly, "Yes." She stood, brushing the dark soil from her hands. She looked at the cabin, the repaired roof, the stone walls, the herb garden, the cubs in the fence. She looked at the pines. She looked at him. "Ask plainly," she said. He met her eyes. "Come with me," he said. "Not because of what I am or what the capital requires, or any reason that has to do with thrones. Because—" He stopped. Something moved in his face, something old and careful, and deciding to come out into the light anyway. "Because I have not known what it is to have someone stand beside me in a very long time. And I find I would rather face what comes next with you than without you." Lottie looked at him for a long moment. The spring light moved through the pine branches above them. A cub yipped in the distance. Somewhere in the village, a blacksmith's hammer rang out, steady as a heartbeat. She reached out and took his hand. His fingers were warm and rough with calluses, and they closed around hers carefully, as though holding something he intended not to drop. "I was going to need a bigger garden at some point anyway," she said. He looked down at their joined hands. Then he looked up at her, and the expression on his face was not the guarded, almost smile she had learned to watch for. It was the full thing, open, certain, the look of a man who had found something he had not let himself search for, and had found it in the most unexpected possible place. They left Eldon Moor on a morning of thin sunshine, with a company of Gareth's riders and 4 growing wolf cubs who required 3 separate handlers and an enormous amount of patience. Marin stood at the edge of the track to see them off, her sharp eyes moving over the group with clinical efficiency. Sula cried briefly, and then was annoyed at herself for it, and then hugged Lottie so hard that the breath left her body. "I'll visit," Lottie said. "You'd better," Sula said, and stepped back, and lifted her chin, and did not cry again. Marin said nothing until the last moment, when Lottie was already mounted. Then she reached up and touched Lottie's hand briefly, a quick, dry press of fingers. No words. She did not need them. The capital was everything Eldon Moor was not, vast and loud and full of the smell of thousands of people and horses and cook fires and politics. Orion moved through it like water finding its level, not without difficulty, not without the weight of 11 lost years and the complicated work of reclaiming them, but with a steady, patient certainty that Lottie recognized as the truest thing about him. There were months of formal proceedings, old wrongs addressed, pack bonds restored, laws rewritten that Castor had distorted. It was slow and exhausting, and sometimes Lottie sat in the gallery of the great hall watching Orion navigate it all and thought about the cabin and the snow and the dark wolf with the broken chain, and marveled at how quietly and completely the world could change. The cubs settled into the capital's great keep with adaptable ease. Ash appointed himself guardian of the main gate, with a seriousness that made the actual guards uncertain whether to be insulted or relieved. Wren discovered the keep's library, and could regularly be found inside it, which Orion claimed was inexplicable, and which Lottie found entirely natural. Flint and Reed remained inseparable and continued their collaborative approach to chaos, which now simply operated on a larger scale. On the last day of autumn, when the capital's trees had gone red and gold, and the air smelled of wood smoke and turning leaves, Orion and Lottie were married in the Great Hall, before the pack leaders in the restored court, and old Gareth, who had ridden 3 days to be there, and sat in the front row looking satisfied in the way of someone whose long patience has finally been vindicated. There were no grand speeches. Orion had never been a man for speeches. He held her hands and said, in the quiet voice she had first heard in a ruined cabin in the middle of a forest, the same words he had said to her on that cold spring morning, "Come with me," and she said yes again, and meant it the same way she had meant it the first time, completely, and without reservation, and as a woman who had made her own choice with her own eyes open. When it was done, Lottie stood in the great hall with her husband's hand in hers, 4 cubs pressed against them from various directions, the autumn light coming through the high windows in long gold bars, and felt, not the hollow, ringing silence of something broken, but its opposite. The deep, warm, certain sound of something whole. She was not an unwanted Omega from Ashford, standing in a cold courtyard waiting for grief to come. She was Lottie. She had bought a ruined cabin. She had stayed when she could have walked away. She had chosen this, all of it, and it had chosen her back. That was enough. That was everything. In Eldon Moor, the cabin was not sold again. Marin and Sula tended the herb garden through every season, and it grew beyond what one garden ought reasonably to be, spilling over its boundaries and down the slope toward the pines in a riot of green and purple and yellow that the village eventually stopped trying to contain. The old Pell land, people called it still, but sometimes, on winter evenings, they called it something else. They called it the place where things turned.